Okay, so today I'm going to talk about this particular book. We're going to start with this particular book called Power, The Role of Man's Will to Power in the World's Economic and Political Affairs by Bertrand Russell. Uh, well, if Russell was to reframe it today, it would be not just man's will to power, but would include all of the genders. But he was writing in 1938, so different times. Anyhow, what Bertrand Russell really says about uh, the origin of power is very, very similar to Friedrich Nietzsche's theory of the will to power. And you can pretty much find it in the first chapter of this book called The Impulse to Power. It's a small chapter, but gives us a very good starting point. What does Russell say about the origin of power? Russell says that A, power emanates from people's ego. So essentially, it is not just financial resources, even though they play a role in power seeking behavior, but it is a person's ego, this innate need to have as much control over one's environment or the people around them or the society. Uh, the ego, a very psychological concept, is what drives the will to power. Uh, Bertrand Russell says that kings like Xerxes or other kings had no shortage of food, no shortage of the comforts and luxury of life, but still they pursued more and more and more power. So it is, in many ways, an infinite pursuit. Another interesting thing that Russell talks about is that power exists where there is fear, and this is an interesting concept. I would reframe it in the terms of risks. So wherever there are risks, there are people who exercise power, or there is power wherever there is risk. Now, before we get into all of that, what we haven't discussed is what power really is. We have been talking about power, but we haven't defined power, and Bertrand Russell does a very good job in defining power. Defines it very simply. He says power is the perceived ability to produce intended effects. Very simple. So if my intended effect is to move this book from here to here, if I have the ability to do that, to produce that intended effect, I'm exercising power, or I have the power, people would say, to do this. And obviously, in terms of more complex activities or more complex outcomes, you would need more complex forms of power. So he also says that, like the electricity that runs through the wires and produces certain intended effects, power is much like that. You cannot probably see it with naked eyes, but it has its own energy and it can take various forms, which is where it gets interesting. Bertrand Russell uses a very Aesop's fables sort of analogy to explain the various types of power that exist. He says that power exists in three essential forms. One is the power of coercion, and the image that he gives to explain it is the pig. So a pig in the sty, if you want to move the pig around, you literally have to exercise power over the pig's body and move that pig from one place to another. Obviously, these are very, raw, one might even say brute examples, but this is what Russell uses, just so that we can initially have a better grip on the concept. So, one is the pig, the power of coercion. Another is carrots. So, uh, the image that Russell uses for that is the donkey. So, just like donkey works with carrots and sticks, he says that carrots are incentives that might lure people and that might bestow some sort of benefit upon people, is one form of power. And another is propaganda. And the image that he uses is a circus animal. So think of a circus bear or a circus elephant or whatever. So these are the three essential forms of power that Bertrand Russell talks about. He obviously talks about a lot of different ways to understand and divide power. I'm going to stick to only a few because we are just discussing about the origins and sources of power right now at this stage. So, uh, pigs, donkeys, and circus animals corresponding to coercion, carrots, and propaganda, or he also says education, ideology, all of them are bunched in the circus animal or the propaganda bit. And what his insight is, and it's actually not exclusively Bertrand Russell's insight, a lot of philosophers have talked about it, that one form of power changes into another. And a lot of times in reality, it is hard to ascertain which form of power has given rise to another. So, for example, Bertrand Russell says that, you know, coercion or conquest is a power that is backed up by wealth because you typically need funders or propaganda. Now, if coercion or conquest is backed up by wealth, where is that wealth coming from? If the wealth is coming from business, then that means a business can exist where there is a rule of law. Rule of law needs coercion. Rule of law needs some sort of policing so that people respect contracts. So in a way, coercion is created by wealth, but wealth is created by coercion. A lot of times, business also needs, or any sort of wealth also needs some sort of wisdom, some sort of legitimacy that that wealth belongs to a certain person. So the power of intellect again comes over there, and you can easily see that one form of power builds on another form of power. And if you really track the origins of power, it is probably a regression ad infinitum. You would never be able to find the origin of power if you're looking at just the sources, because one source builds on another. So think of it in terms of energy, think of it in terms of electricity. Okay, so the idea over here is that there are these three forms of power broadly: coercion, carrots, and propaganda, and they build one on another. The other interesting idea that Russell talks about, and I'm going to quote him over here, is that as qualities required for achieving prominence changes, so the prominent men change. Again, in a modern time, it could be men, women, other genders. But the message over here is that with time, the type of power which is required changes. And as the times change and the type of power required changes, so do our understanding of prominence changes. So the leaders that you would see in one era would be very different from the leaders that you would see in another. To give you a raw example, in the medieval times, most of the land was owned by the warrior classes. Most of the powerful people were belonging to the warrior classes. And that's because the fundamental type of risk, and see, again, the whole concept of risk comes over here. The most fundamental type of risk that you would see in the medieval time was war, because in feudal states, one state would be warring against another, or one tribe would be warring against another. So, the prominent leaders of that time were essentially warlords, as opposed to now, where wars are much less frequent. Actually, in the past few years, they have again gained prominence, but typically after the Second World War, wars have become much less frequent. The nations have sort of expanded to their maximum capacity militarily, or they have sort of understood that there is a balance militarily that has been achieved, and you cannot imagine annexing new land by war in the modern times. So, where do human beings choose to compete then? Human beings choose to compete in the economic sphere. So, now is the time where the modern kings or queens are really the entrepreneurs, the millionaires, the billionaires of the world. and that is where power is typically being exercised, or the real competition of power remains there. Which is not to say that the coercive power or the traditionally understood political power has vanished, but what you can really see is that the new avenues of gaining power are in the economic sphere mostly. Uh, Now, if you take a historical look, now I'm going to my book, Our Egalitarian Universe, where in some of the chapters I discuss about this historical vision of power. Uh, I'm going to give you a very stylized story. Things are obviously in real life not as simple as it would seem in this particular theory, but it is just to explain the concept, which is that imagine a time, think of Paleolithic era of people living in rudimentary tribes, and living in caves, or just roaming around. Agriculture has not been invented. Human beings are not sedentary. Every day you are living in the fear of being attacked by animals. Human beings are scared of thunder. They are scared of excessive rain. They are scared of a lot of these natural phenomena. So the real risk over there is, number one, the risk of knowing how to survive when some of these extraordinary things happen, such as a thunder, or such as dying from eating a poisonous plant, etc. Now, during that time, people who were knowledgeable, or people who were alchemists, or people, in India, the priestly classes, in many other societies, they would wield a lot of power. So the person who could tell you that if there is a thunder, I know where the closest cave is, and if you're out to hunt, I can tell you where you'll find the game, or where not to go, otherwise you'll die over there, or which fruit to eat, and which one is poisonous. Those knowledgeable folks would wield a lot of power, and that's why in Indus Valley civilizations, in the Mesopotamian civilizations, in a lot of mythology, talk about King Solomon, etc., etc., you find this idea of a priestly king. So, a king who's essentially a king because he or she has a lot of knowledge, and essentially is a wise person. Now, once those sort of uncertainties are reduced, once a society has solved some of those problems, they have understood how to survive in a thunderstorm, and how to acquire enough food for themselves, etc., etc. Some of those problems are baseline solved, and what sort of problems emerge? The new types of problems that emerge are human beings competing with each other to gain the best sort of land, to gain the best sort of resources. So essentially, human tribes fighting against human tribes, because now everybody knows where is the best land, what is the best way to survive, etc. But those resources are limited in many ways. And what happens, and this is where I'm taking a purely materialistic view, not the ego view that Bertrand Russell talks about. But another strand of what Russell actually talks about, that with changing times, changing needs, the dimensions of power also change. So when tribes are fighting against tribes, or human security is the main concern, then warlords who can provide that security becomes the most fundamental form of power. And that is the form of power that we have traditionally understood in the modern times, because our memory of power comes from the medieval times broadly. And most of the written text has covered that form of power, which is essentially coercive. So for the longest time, most of the power was concentrated amongst warlords, because they were sort of solving the greatest problem that the society had, which was security. Okay? Security, order, etc., etc. And now you come to this era, after the formation of nation states, after the formation of what is called the Westphalian states, and after World War II, actually, where war after that became sort of not worth it, even though wars did happen. And we are seeing that with the Russia Ukraine war and what's happening in Israel and Palestine. War has re-emerged on the scene of the on the face of the world history. But for most of this time after the World War, we saw relative peace, and the paradigm of growth for any nation was not essentially war, it was economy. And there we see, you know, the CEOs, the venture capitalists, the financial world really taking the mantle of power. So a new paradigm of power emerges, and that doesn't mean that the power of knowledge or the power of you know brute coercive force diminished, but this new form of power emerged. Now, it is also interesting to imagine a society where you know, the sources of money are stable, or are at least concentrated to a small number of people, where any regular person could not realistically hope to easily achieve that level of wealth. And some argue that we are almost there, where 1% of the wealthy own 50 or 80% of the global resources, uh, which might mean, at least right now, the idea is that anyone can achieve wealth. But maybe, let us say, long run into the future, people start thinking that only a few people will achieve wealth, and all of the rest of us will essentially work for them, and that's how we survive. And with AI, etc., if you have been reading Yuval Noah Harari, all of these scenarios start seeming more plausible. So the idea is that, imagine an oligopolistic world where wealth is stabilized in the hands of a few, and the regular person cannot hope to achieve that sort of a wealth. And even those who have excessive wealth cannot hope to radically change the amount of wealth that they possess. Okay. So what happens then when they cannot hope? So, for example, like countries could not hope to radically change their boundaries or the geography. Imagine a world where the oligopoly is so entrenched that a person whose net worth is, let's say, 10 billion could not imagine that their net worth would suddenly become 100 billion. Okay. So everyone is sort of fixed in their range. Then you're again in that position where countries or political power, coercive power was. Then newer arenas would emerge where people would compete for power. What those arenas would be, we don't know right now. uh, it could be creativity, it could be art, it could be just executive effectiveness and efficiency. We don't know, but it is entirely possible that that could happen. The reason why I say that things, this is a stylized story, that first the wise people had power, then the warrior class had power, and now the moneyed class has power. uh, it does not mean that things move in this linear fashion only. uh, the way that the world changes and the risks in the world evolve are very dynamic. uh, you know f- Everybody was expecting that the main competition in the world is only around wealth, until the last few years, where we saw the Russia Ukraine war happen, and the Israel Palestine war happening, etc., etc. The idea over here is that the world can change in abrupt and unpredictable manners, and different changes in the world could require different types of power to be exercised, because it creates different types of problems. And of course, I've already said that all of these three forms of power coexist, but sometimes just one becomes a lot more uh, focal, or one becomes a lot more pervasive than others. So what you see is that different times essentially would create different types of power. Uh, one last thing which I think I should mention over here is that Bertrand Russell again talks about three different formats of power, which are not really sources, but just think of them as formats. And one is traditional, another is revolutionary, and the third one is naked. Uh, Traditional and revolutionary are just juxtaposed to each other. Traditional is that, okay, maybe I had coercive power, I was a general, so the my next generation would could also be qualified to hold that coercive power, or I hold a position which has traditionally been considered as important. And now, even when the times have changed, even when, let's say, coercive power is not the primary problem that the world is facing, just because traditionally that was a problem and that was given importance, it is given importance even now. So you see that in practice, that many of the old school saints, or priests, the pope, or royalty, which used to actually wield political power in the world and exercise coercive power in the world, but does not right now, still holds on to some of that power, because it is a power developed or inculcated as a matter of habit amongst people. So that's the traditional form of power, which tends to survive a longer time even when conditions change. The other is revolutionary power, which challenges the traditional power, and it is usually backed up by a new creed. It is usually backed up by a new idea, a new sense of equilibrium in the society. And this particular form of power can again come by challenging the traditional form of power, or by giving a new vision for what a new reality is. Just like traditional form of power, it can exist in the domains of coercive power, or it could be a revolutionary incentive based power, or it could be a revolutionary propaganda power. So the pig, the donkey, the circus animal could exist in traditional form of power and in revolutionary power as well. And then there is naked power. What does Bertrand Russell mean by naked power? Naked power, what he really means is a power that sort of exists in a brute fashion, where a traditional monarch might sometimes in order to safeguard their position, might use excessive and open coercive power, or might use excessive power of money incentives, or might use excessive propaganda power. So when there is an excessive reliance on the tools of power, the coercive power, the incentive based power, and the propaganda power, that becomes naked power, which relates to our previous discussion that was on visible power, hidden power, and invisible power. So the visible exercise of power is naked power, uh, as per Bertrand Russell. So where are we in terms of what is the origin of power, since we are still at that topic? Number one is that the origin of power stems from ego and fear. Okay. The second is that power is much like energy. You cannot really, trace which form of power creates which other form of power. The forms keep changing. So the energy remains, the structure of energy keeps changing. And there are these three different forms, at least, which is coercive power, the carrot based incentive power, and the propaganda power. And each form can morph into another, and these can change. And finally, uh, you have these various formats of power: the traditional power, revolutionary power, and naked versus hidden power. Uh, Different times would create different types of powers, or different times would bring different types of powers into prominence, even though all forms of power might coexist. So that is our discussion for today. And the next time, we are going to get really, really deep into some, you know, historical, example based, as well as theoretical aspects of the origin of power. So it's going to get a little more interesting, a little more, deep into the subject of power from the next video onwards. But if you watched the first three videos, this being the third one, you have covered the basics, and which in itself is a lot. It is, worth a lot of academic research and papers and historical evidence. So these three videos are more like fundamentals, and from the fourth one, we take a deep dive, and I'll see you then.